A precocious writer named Thad Beaumont, Timothy Hutton, writes high-level novels under his real name while he writes trashy and violent crime noirs under his pen name, George Stark. He decides after a fan tries to out him to reveal that he and George are the same person to the press. After doing so, there happens to be a string of murders similar to the ones in Stark's novels. It's up to Beaumont and Sheriff Alan Pangborn, Michael Rooker, to figure out what the hell is going on. So this was kind of a weird/tough movie to watch, mainly because of how this movie is barely available for streaming on the internet with the exception of Vudu and iTunes, not even available on Amazon Prime or free sites, so I had to watch a crappy bootleg version on YouTube with terrible audio quality. By all means, if you're desperate enough to watch the movie, link is in the description. But be forewarned, it's barely worth it. Even with my shitty quality version that I had to watch, it's still a pretty awesome movie. It was one of the two movies that came out in 1993 that had the character of Alan Pangborn, the other of which I'll be talking about next time. Here he's played by Michael Rooker, and he does a good and believable job. He was a calm but no-nonsense kind of cop. He was a man desperate to find a sadistic homicidal maniac, but didn't want to risk an innocent man because of it, as well as him being adamant in not believing the insane story Beaumont is trying to convey to him and willing to take Beaumont in if he has to. He's more portrayed as a side character here, while in the next film I'll be talking about Needful Things, he's the protagonist. I'll talk more comparisons when we get to that point. Timothy Hutton stars as Thad Beaumont, and eventually George Stark, his evil alter ego. It's hard to gauge a performance due to the poor quality of film I had to watch, but he did an okay job as Beaumont and Stark. He wasn't really better as one or the other, so he was only okay at both. Beaumont was kind of interesting, but was a bit too bland in execution to make me care about his character. Stark was also pretty interesting, but he was a bit too over the top in his portrayal to make me like him as a believable villain, so the performance doesn't really have a middle ground. Stark should have been evil, but more subtle, and Beaumont should have been good and down to earth, but a bit more, lively. I don't really know how to describe it, just maybe somehow make him less generic. I don't know, maybe it's the writing's fault, and less so having to do with Hutton. The rest of the supporting cast do a serviceable job, but nobody really stands out outside of Hutton's dual performance and Rooker. I think the story is a bit weird, but I liked it. As I was reading up on it, it was a very good and personal story for King, as this related to him with his Richard Bachman pen name and how he was outed eventually, as well as the main character representing his want and need to get clean from alcohol and substance abuse. It's very strange how this and Needful Things really go hand in hand with its personal ideas and themes from King, and both movies were released the same year, despite this being filmed 2 to 3 years prior to release, as well as having the same character in both with Pangborn. I just find it to be very interesting is all. The effects were hit and miss, mainly practical versus digital. Practical effects and makeup were very good, while the digital effects looked really half-assed, but that's mainly due to Orion's financial problems during production. Overall, I think this is definitely an underrated King movie. The story is interesting, the personal themes from King were pretty intriguing, and despite Hutton not delivering an amazing performance, he still did a good job in the dual role. I definitely recommend watching this one, however, I would risk the $10 and just buy the DVD instead of watching it on YouTube. The Dark Half is an intriguing beast. I still don't know what to make of it after rewatching it. It's a case where the ideas presented are more interesting than the overall story. How it has these ideas of identity, substance abuse, and possible mental illness. But the ideas themselves are not executed as well as they should have been. They weren't given as much time to develop or be explored as well as they should have been. I don't know much about the book, but as I did state in the previous review, I do know it was a personal story for King based on his Richard Bachman pen name. I do wish there was a bit more of that touch in there than not, like giving the audience that sort of relatability by giving up a part of yourself. In this case, it's a pen name, but for the audience, they could relate to it in a different way. The quote-unquote killing of George Stark isn't really given a ton of time. Beaumont just kind of decides it after little deliberation from his wife, especially when it was such a big part of his life and himself. Quite literally. It was a genuine separate identity that would make literature that could make him live comfortably. There are moments where Beaumont feeds into the personality, but it's not enough to make it interesting. The substance abuse stuff isn't anything new for King's writing, but it pretty much gets a passing mention a couple times and that's it, when that was also a very personal story for King. So I just wish we could have gotten more in that respect, especially when this was the last novel he wrote before he got sober, so there is that as well. Although it is interesting how I felt that we could have gotten more, because I felt that the movie was also too long. It kind of just felt like it was going on, mainly with the third act. The entire movie is pretty slow, but it only gets very noticeable in the first and third acts. Then there is also the tone. It has this sort of weird imbalanced tone that I wanted to like more, like heightened reality when it comes to Stark. I would be lying if I said I didn't like it at all, because I feel like it feeds into Romero's style more, mainly with bigger studio films like Creepshow and Monkey Shines. But I wish that Beaumont's side was in a slightly more heightened reality. Maybe more and more as the film goes on, like it is separate at first, but then it builds and builds where they are unidentifiable from one another. And then that heightened reality is more of a brutal, visceral side, not necessarily horror, although that's not bad, but just more of that hard and gritty style that is more represented of the Alexis Machine character that Stark writes about. And maybe Stark isn't totally like that either, he just adopted that persona to get revenge. But outside of the stuff that didn't work, the stuff I did like was pretty damn good. I am more appreciative over Hutton's performance, he did a good job as both. Beaumont I don't think was bland, and while I do think Stark was over the top, that was the point. Even then it still worked with what they were going for. Christopher Young's score was also really excellent, the mysteriousness of Stark's birth was intriguing, the supporting cast all do a good job, and Alan Pangborn, played by Michael Rooker, was a great character. He cared, but he still had to do his job, and once Beaumont really started to look like an actual murderer, that had to go out the window. You can't hold on to those personal attachments. I think they did that well, and Rooker was great. Overall, it's a very weird film, but not in like a fun way, just sort of a confused way. I think Romero was at the mercy of the studio and forced to do a lot of these dumber ideas that they wanted. At least that's my guess, because I feel like if it were up to him and only him, he would have done things a lot differently. But nowadays, it's free on a bunch of platforms. I would weirdly say, check it out.